My name is Nancy I. Annie, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area, and also with the San Jose Santa Clara League. Our panel is titled Future Challenges, and we all will realize that the future is now, and that the challenges need action immediately. And of the issues facing us, climate change is of greatest importance to the quality of life that we will experience. Our panel will address the issues and challenges in the context of the new vision for open space. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, Matt. My apologies. Matt Brennan. And he is with ESA, which is Environmental Science Associates, if you are not able to discover that from the biographies. He will address sea level rise and the natural measures for adaptation and mitigation.
I had promised the rest of my panel members I'd try to stay seated and not intimidate them, but I'll move the mic down for you when I'm done. Thanks for having me today. I'm an environmental engineer. I work with an environmental services company, and one of the things we do is look at natural systems planning and management, and try to do that in a framework for current conditions and future conditions so that we build more resilient, sustainable spaces, and particularly open spaces. And I'm going to talk today about how sea level rise particularly prompts opportunities for creating sort of a shared way to respond to sea level rise and to provide more open space. So at the beginning of the 21st century here, we sort of stand at the edge of sea level rise, and we have a common response to that, which is to put on our waders, build our walls, and get ready for sea level rise. So looking at the projections for sea level rise out to the mid-century, that looks like a pretty good proposition. Might even sort of bring some of that, fun of jumping into puddles when we were little kids as a response. If you look at projections by the end of the century, it starts to look a little more uncomfortable, a little bit more of a risky proposition, but hopefully we're still staying dry. After that, we will take up scuba diving. So I think this is where we have an opportunity to deal with sea level rise and think about ways to sort of set ourselves on an adaptation strategy for sea level rise in our, that sort of the bayfront community, the area where we really interact with the bay, and create both valuable and scenic open space, but also help with the way we manage our land and our shorelines to accommodate sea level rise. So here's an example of, one of the things we have in San Francisco Bay is one of the longest term records of sea level rise in history. And so here's the history of the way sea level rise has been increasing for about the last century or so, and so it has a slight increasing slope. If you take this and project it into the future, you're talking by the end of this century something in the realm of 19 inches. So sort of that first picture I showed of, maybe knee-deep water around your waders. But if we start to think about the impacts that are coming with the amount of carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere and the other greenhouse trapping gases, the projections that we start to see start to get much more staggering and steeper and harder to deal with. So that 14 number that I picked is pretty much where the projections are sort of coalescing to for the mid-century. In the longer term, there certainly is greater uncertainty because we both need to understand how the natural system is going to react to that much carbon dioxide, but also how our policies and practice going forward, how much greenhouse gas trapping emissions we might make in the next century. So those make it a little bit difficult to project, but certainly the upward trend of this and the steepening trend of this are really a done deal in terms of the science. So in San Francisco Bay, the bay makes us unique and gives our place its name, but it also is a drowned river valley when you ask a geologist who's looking at the long term, which means that, as this picture shows, even though we have the nice hillsides around us, most of the development of the bay is happening in the flats that is right in the area that is quite vulnerable to sea level rise, and even changes when you start talking about a foot or so that we're going to be seeing in the next 20 or 25 years, and certainly when you get to the much higher rates by the end of the century. So here's an example of what parts of the Bay Area would be at risk from those future sea level rise projections. So you can see it's a Bay Area-wide problem. One thing that I'd also point out about this map is that the areas that are at risk are areas that in the past were typically marshland and open space. A lot of it now has been developed, but fortunately some of it has been only developed to a much lesser degree. It was salt ponds and areas now that resource agencies has taken over, which really gives us an opportunity to do something different in those areas. The other problem with sea level rise is not just that the mean sea level rise is going up, which would, maybe you might not see that effect. If you go out and stand on the seawall at San Francisco's Embarcadero, you can kind of look over the edge and say, a couple feet, I'm going to still make it. But that's your typical tides. But where you really need to be thinking about protecting for is the extreme conditions, the flood conditions. And we already have significant flood risk around the bay, as you see here, from sort of a fairly an event that might happen every couple of years, but certainly nothing exceptional, nothing on the order of our Hurricane Sandy or our Katrina. And this sort of flooding really puts a lot of our built infrastructure at risk. So for instance here, in Marin County, actually, they face the parking lots over there in the rideshare. You see, warning about high tide because there, a couple times a month, they actually see flooding in their parking lots. There's the extreme case of many of our neighborhoods are mapped in the FEMA floodplains, and that's the kind of event that's scaled as returned to the 1 in 100-year event, the sort of Hurricane Sandy scale, which is what this picture's from, that puts many of our homes at risk. Much of our infrastructure, like besides the road infrastructure I showed previously, but also the airports, Oakland and San Francisco predominantly. This is the LaGuardia Airport right after Hurricane Sandy. And then lots of the infrastructure that you don't necessarily think about. So this is a picture of one of Redwood City's wastewater treatment plants, which, because of the natural capital of what the bay provides in terms of a place to put your treated wastewater, and also from being on the downslope side of your city, is often where wastewater treatment plants are situated. And so as a good reminder of that, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has come up with a great advertising campaign recently where the wastewater treatment plant is speaking to you. And I'll just leave it to your imagination about what sorts of things happen when the people who are dealing with the crap don't deal with the crap. So in response to this pressure, the sea level rise pressure, there's sort of the hold the line approach, the traditional approach, maybe you might call it a Dutch approach, which is to, even though we're living on subsided baylands that are already at risk, to take the levees that are out there, think, well, if they're not quite good enough, we'll just build them up more, we'll armor them a little bit higher, and then when sea level rise comes, we'll be safe. Well, this has some problems. It tends to erode sediment on the front side of it, and as you saw from the picture that I put in the beginning, this will work for a while, but there's a certain point when building higher and higher is going to get you to the point where you're going to need scuba tanks rather than levees. So one of the places where we can learn from is the natural shoreline. So the way that San Francisco Bay and its marshes were built were actually from the preceding 10,000 years when we had historic sea level rise at a rate which allowed the marshes to gradually erode on the bay side, and some of that sediment was resuspended by waves and other activity and moved upwards, and the marsh plain, and particularly the plants on the marsh plain, helped build that marsh upwards, and you had sort of a much gradual, slower and more resilient transition landward. So if you take that approach in areas where you have the landscape behind it. So I'm particularly talking about the areas like the salt ponds that you fly over in the south part of San Francisco Bay, where you have large open water areas. I'm not necessarily talking about the Embarcadero in San Francisco, where you have to pick up the ferry terminal building and move it somewhere else. But in places where you have this opportunity to take the Bayshore levee and move it inland, restore the area in between into a marsh habitat. That restored marsh helps you in several ways. It provides erosion and scour protection for your levee. It provides a bench on which to build your levee, so your levee, you don't have to start from sort of negative elevations down below. And the marsh itself provides wave attenuation so that the height of the levee doesn't have to be quite as high as what you would have built on the Bayshore. In fact, there's even some opportunities in some places where you can integrate the marsh not just with sort of the flood protection infrastructure, but actually also with the wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. So this is a case where when you have those wastewater treatment plants that are frequently on the marsh edge, the water that they're discharging, it's been purified and treated, can serve as a way to help build the back of the marsh to provide a type of landscape that we don't see around the marsh anymore, sort of an uplands transition marsh area that needs a little bit more fresh water, and build that backside of the marsh and provide even a little bit more habitat relief. And then that freshwater flow helps support that ecosystem on the backside. So we've done some economic analysis of this approach to protecting the shoreline, and come up with rough estimates. If you take that, build the big levee right on the shoreline, that pencils out to something on the order of $12 million a mile to build the levees into the future. Whereas if you take the approach of the smaller approach that's fronted by sea level rise, you can maybe split that in half. So with that, I'll leave you with this vision of sort of a future shoreline. Moving from the left to the right side, you can see there's that sort of incorporated flood protection levee that could also be a recreation trail, some upland grassland into a tidal marsh that provides you with a landscape that's more flexible and able to move and react to sea level rise, rather than sort of build right up against it and pinch out the open space. Here are a few other additional resources, and I'll take any questions after we're done.
Our next speaker is Nat Seavey, and he will address habitat protection and biodiversity. He is Research Director of Pacific Coast and Central Valley Group at the Point Blue Conservation Science.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to have an opportunity to talk to all of you. It's been so exciting watching these conversations today, and thinking about what this means for the future of open space in the Bay Area. So when I was thinking about, when I got the invitation, and it was to talk about the challenges to the future of biodiversity, I thought, well, okay, maybe what I can do is talk about what we do, but really talk about what our experience is doing that and how that's kind of leading us towards some of these new challenges and opportunities that are coming up in the future. So I work at Point Blue Conservation Science. We've been around since 1966, and you might have known us before as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. We've recently gone through a name change that we're really excited about. So our mission is we have about 140 scientists, and they advance nature-based solutions to climate change, habitat loss, and other environmental threats for wildlife and people. And we do that by working in partnerships, by bringing science into these conversations, and by doing outreach to communicate these ideas to a wide, diverse audience of people. So for me, personally, what this means, I'm a wildlife biologist by training, and I kind of see my job as having two parts. I'm a scientist, so essentially what I do is I go out and I try to understand what wildlife needs and how they see the world. And if we develop that understanding, then we can begin to design these projects and to design habitat protection in a way that will preserve that biodiversity out there on the landscape. So part of it is trying to see the world as an animal sees it and understand what that means. And then the second part of my job is to help communicate that information that I've learned and that I know other people have learned, and help communicate that to decision makers in a way that allows us to put habitat protection on the ground, in a way that allows us to do better land management, and in a way that creates the future that we want to in terms of biodiversity. So in that context, that's kind of where I'm coming from. And in that context, for me, there's kind of really three big challenges that I see in the future. And some of these I think you'll recognize from some of the conversations we've already had this morning. The first one is that the climate is changing. So we are facing a world that will be very different in the next 50 to 100 years. It's already changing, and those changes are going to continue. Temperatures are going to rise, so it will be warmer. And that's going to be a challenge because it means that a lot of the precipitation that we have right now that falls as snow is now going to fall as rain, and we're not going to be able to store our water as snow in the mountains. So that's going to, that's going to be a real big challenge. At the same time, we're going to see these changes in temperature are going to impact the timing of that plants develop and the timing of animal reproduction. And so all of these things that we're used to happening at very specific times are going to be changing. There may also be changes in rainfall. Right now, the climate models aren't very clear about whether that will be more rainfall or less rainfall. And so one of that things that means is that we have to come up with ways of adapting in the future that can accommodate that uncertainty that we don't know what those conditions will be like. And so for us, and for many people out there, what we're coming to is that we need to think about how we can make climate smart decisions. And so the information that Matt was just showing is very much a way of thinking about, okay, sea level will be rising. That's one of the consequences of climate change. How do we make decisions about how we protect our shorelines in a way that's climate smart, in a way that we can deal with the fact that sea level is rising? We don't know exactly how much, we don't know exactly how fast, and so we need these opportunities to build resilience. So there's really two aspects of that in our work that we come up against in terms of making things climate smart. And one of them is climate mitigation, and that's the idea that we want to do things that will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and ultimately take care of the climate problem and lead toward climate stability. And so that's where you hear about things about carbon sequestration, about managing land differently in order to sequester as much carbon as possible. And those conversations are all something that we'll be talking about in the future of open space, I'm sure. And then the other pieces of it is adaptation. And adaptation is dealing with the climate change that happens, that we're locked into a certain amount of climate change in the future, and we need to look for our opportunities to manage land differently in a way that will prepare for those changes. So that may be things like anticipating that there may be more fires, anticipating that we may need to plant vegetation that's more tolerant of drought conditions. So climate change, that's one big thing. The second thing that comes to mind is something that we've heard several talks on, is the idea that we can invest in projects that provide multiple benefits, right? So we can be investing in projects that provide fish and wildlife habitat and are also providing these other ecosystem services to people. One of the examples that I think is really exciting was we heard Wendy talk in her first talk about floodplains and that those protect people from flooding. In the Central Valley, we also know that those floodplains provide habitat for young salmon to grow. And so when those floodplains are flooded with floodwaters, the young salmon move out there and they grow really quickly. The larger you are when you leave that floodplain, the better chance you have of making it back to spawn again. So that's an example where when we can start designing floodplains by setting back those levees to provide some extra space for the river, we can also be providing the kind of habitat that we know salmon use and need. And we can also be thinking about what are the opportunities to have some agriculture in there as well, and how can we find a way to fit all of those things into the limited amount of open space that we have. And then the last one that I think is interesting is we've talked a lot about valuing ecosystem services. And there's kind of two sides to that. One is just figuring out, okay, well, how much is that worth? And then there's this other piece of it, how do you measure it? And then the final piece is, okay, what do you do with that information? And there's a lot of work out there right now among the conservation organizations looking at ways to develop market mechanisms that would help pay people to generate these ecosystem services. For a lot of people, that's kind of a scary thing, okay? It kind of brings in capitalism into a situation that has maybe not been driven by that very much in the past. And so conservation organizations have not been used to dealing with that. And they very much are these days. And that's a really new component to the way that we're thinking about conservation. So I think that in the future, you'll hear more and more about market mechanisms, and that will be related very closely to this conversation about ecosystem services. So I think all of these things are extremely exciting. We're thinking about conservation in really new and different ways than we ever have, and we're also thinking about it in the context of climate change. And that is really something new to the conservation conversation. So it's been great to be here, and I'll look forward to questions later.
Our final speaker for the day is Jen Fox, and she is the Executive Director of the Bay Area Open Space Council, to whom we all owe so much. Thank you. Jen.
Wow, well, thank you. And I just want to say the Bay Area Open Space Council is lucky to work with all of the previous presenters and all of you. And I was going to talk about regional level challenges, et cetera, but I'll probably skip over a bunch of slides because I think there's a lot of themes that we've heard in common today. I think this is a little bit about my organization, but while you read that, I would just mention that I noticed that your annual meetings face a lot of big challenges. In 2013, you talked about water. In 2012, you talked about housing. In 2011, natural resources. In 2010, climate change. Land is a part of these problems and also a part of these solutions. And so I do want to talk a little bit about that. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment, quickly review where we've come from. As past speakers have noticed, 150 years ago, things looked pretty different around here. This is a picture from 1850, and at that time there were 101,000 people, 110,000 people, and now we're over 7.1 million. As other speakers have commented, we expect about 2040, by 2040 that we'll have about 9 million. 150 years ago, let me go back to the beginning. Ooh, you get a quick preview in reverse. All right. I will also say that 150 years ago, people came here to make money in the gold rush. People are still coming here to make money, and that's not a bad thing. People are also coming here because of the quality of life. People come to the Bay Area because of the quality of life here. What you'll notice by this slide, which shows 2010 census data and ethnic diversity in the Bay Area, is, first of all, our population is a lot more diverse than in 2010, or in 150 years ago, but also our population the resources are disproportionately available. And I think it's interesting, this slide in context with Matt's earlier slide, when you look at where people are located in relation to places, not just what can they do to enjoy life, but also, where do they live and what kind of hazards do they face. 150 years ago, people also started a movement to preserve parks. Just up in those hills, there were redwoods. In California, it should be proud because, we led the way nationally by creating California state parks. My organization 2 weeks ago had a 150th anniversary celebration for state parks. And we talked about the challenges and problems ahead for state parks, but also the legacy that we have. 150 years ago, the map of the Bay Area looked like this. And you'll see as I talk that as we go forward, we show the land that has been acquired and the land that's being protected thanks to the good work of a lot of people in this room, including the voters in the Bay Area and the folks that all of you work with. So you know, what I want to say is this map shows us what we have in the Bay Area. And a version of this map, as Wendy described earlier today, is available on our website. And it'll show you that we've protected 1.3 million acres. I know an earlier person asking a question asked about, you know, how much of that is truly protected for wildlife, et cetera. And my organization has done a plan called the Conservation Lands Network, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people are more interested. But what I would say is between the kind of work that Andrea described, between the at-risk report that Jeremy talked about, and a number of other tools that you all know and use, the INVEST tool that Wendy talked about, we have a lot of strategic plans and a lot of the data, like Nat mentioned. We also have 215 organizations in the Bay Area that own and manage land. And it's a diverse group of organizations, as you can see from this partial list. There's strength in that diversity. The City of Oakland talking to Fish and Wildlife, et cetera. We in the Bay Area have a lot to be really proud of. And the other thing in the Bay Area is that people really do value open space. They use it to connect with nature, for time with family, local food production, using transit and trails. We have a lot to prove at the rest of the country. I feel really lucky I get called to speak to a lot of meetings because of people learning from the Bay Area. We have that legacy. We also have challenges ahead. I won't spend time on this slide because we've been talking about some of those challenges. And I'll mention that in addition to kind of the big picture challenges, there's there's very specific challenges on protecting the land. Speakers have talked about them, but this is a picture of the fire on Mount Diablo this year. We pay to fight fires. If you look at the upper right corner, we really have to work. It costs a lot of money to support the active use in urban parks, where the majority of people, as you saw from an earlier slide, live. We have to maintain water and other infrastructure. This is Devalle State Park, where water infrastructure, East Bay Regional Park District is actually operating this land for state parks because of budget issues there. And it costs a lot of work to maintain that infrastructure. And as questioners have asked about, you know, we have to provide viable options and policy protection for working lands. And so I guess what I would say is we need political will and funds to do all of this. This slide shows a picture of big statewide funding in the past 20 years. What you'll notice is there's been no big bond measure in 8 years, and the funds left available for the Bay Area and these existing the existing bonds are really limited. We don't expect much on the horizon for the next few years statewide. So, it is sobering. I will say there's a lot of good news. As I mentioned, people really care locally. People have come to value their state parks. They really think locally. And that's something in the Bay Area that we can really value. But as Sam pointed out earlier today, the State Coastal Conservancy can do more where there's active organizations and where there's funding. And so on the next slide, this is going to just have a few measures, and I know all of you in this room have worked on other measures, but what you'll notice is a few things. First of all, funding locally it's disproportionate to need oftentimes, and it's not available in all counties. The other thing you'll notice is it requires a 2/3 majority. So in Alameda County, there was going to be a transit-related measure that was going to do a lot of great works on trails. It had 66.5% of the vote. It did not pass. And this is the kind of situation that open space districts, cities, counties are in. So, it's a real situation. It's one that, as you can see, like Karen said earlier, it's us working within this room, but it's also working beyond because it comes down to those voters. I won't spend too much time on this, but what I'll say is that, page up. I'm going to skip a few slides, but what I will say is that, other speakers have talked about the interlinks, about innovative funding sources, and they'll talk about the linkages between these different measures. And, I think they've done a great job, and they're continuing to work at how do we integrate funding in the same way that nature integrates these ecosystem services. I'll say that we're at a really, really special moment in time. We need to get SB 375 to work. SB 375 really envisions connecting the land use and transportation elements, the different sides of the greenhouse gas equations. Our legislatures have not only have they recognized this, but they've said that we can do it. And as we solve that equation, I think that the Bay Area can really serve as a model. So if we can think of it as a region, you know, we can honor that we really do have these challenges ahead, but also that with a lot of the kind of work that you guys are doing, we have the tools and the legacy that we need to do it, and this is what can be. So this is why I do the work, why I'm really excited to see all of you here today, and I'm going to stop there because I think a lot of this stuff has been mentioned, so maybe we can just go straight into questions. I really look forward to your questions.
During the El Nino year, I read that there was a lot of destruction of habitat. How much worse is habitat destroyed by drought?
But I'll take a shot at that. And so drought definitely has impacts on habitat, undoubtedly, you know, and that is part of a Mediterranean climate. I think the issue is thinking about how can we manage our land in a way that we have as much resiliency in it as possible, and looking at what kinds of decisions we can make that take that resiliency away versus what kind of decisions that we can make that build upon that resiliency that's out there. So yes, there are negative effects, and we should be looking to do what we can to build upon the natural resiliency that's out there.
How much open space is enough for the projected population?
That's a great question. I guess what I would say is a few things. First of all, I think one of the challenges that we are working on along with our member organizations is that open space is disproportionately available. And so, we can have 1.3 million acres right now. That's a great amount of open space, but it doesn't mean that more kids are actually getting out onto open space every day. So things like urban parks, things like accessibility to parks by transit are all really important. And so I guess I would just say it's one of those things that it comes down to quality of the interaction, not as much as quantity. So I'm not going to put out a number. But the other thing I might also just mention is if you look at the population projections California-wide, the Bay Area actually isn't growing as fast as other places in California. So that's part of the reason that I just really wanted to mention how much we can serve as a model. Because in the Bay Area, we have some great infrastructure. We have parks that are doing amazing things. And the more that we can continue to make those kind of things available for all Bay Area residents, the more we'll help show the state how that's going to be a solution elsewhere in the state where there are even more limited resources and even more increasing populations.
Here's a question for Matt Brennan. What is the status of identifying areas that will be affected by sea level rise? 1. Do we have comprehensive maps showing height above current sea level? And 3, do we have technology to automate production of such maps? For example, using data collected by airplane or satellite?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's the effort to map and understand where our vulnerabilities are has been taken in a number of different scales. At the Bay-wide scale, there's work that's been done out of the map that I showed briefly that you saw was a map from the USGS and work that they've done. So that's certainly one you could pursue, and they have a nice online viewer. There's another group from the USGS that's working on a project called Our Coast, Our Future that also has some tools where which you can do this, and it has included that prior map I showed was kind of what's referred to in the trade as the bathtub map, which is just sort of you just take the elevation and put it on top of the existing land surface. One of the things that happens is you could sort of get a picture from that flood picture I showed with waves overtopping the shoreline is that the shoreline shape is likely to change in response to those sorts of events. So the Our Coast, Our Future work is working on trying to incorporate some of those physical processes of how the shoreline would change. And then a number of entities are starting to do practice at local scales. So we work for a project for the city of Mountain View where they really try to identify all of their shoreline vulnerabilities and try to figure out a plan and sort of a timeline for when they would have to implement those so that they could start, bringing that over to their 10-year city plan and think about where their vulnerabilities and where they need to spend money. And a number of other cities are starting to do that as well, both on the Bay side, and then the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy have been funding a bunch of work through the local coastal plans to do that on the coast side. So it's getting there. It's a little bit patchwork right now, but it's coming.
Thank you. How does water transfer from Northern California to Southern California figure into your plans? Loaded questions.
So I can speak to that a little bit from a bird perspective. That's where I tend to work on it. And so the transfer of water from Northern California to Southern California right now goes through the Delta. And the Delta is also kind of at the center of the Central Valley, which is an incredibly important place for migratory birds. And so the challenge that we have is thinking about when we move that water and when we come up with a fix for the Delta, and certainly there is a real need to have a fix for the Delta, how do we do that in a way that we also preserve the migratory bird habitat that's also out there? And so there's a number of different organizations that are working, thinking about the different alternatives and thinking about, as those get put in place, what are the actions that we're going to need to take in order to maintain bird habitat. And a lot of that bird habitat is based on the agricultural lands out there. So there's a lot of really strong partnerships that are really exciting between agriculture in the Delta and the bird conservation.
Can I touch on that too? Because I think, there's a lot of work that all of us are doing, and that kind of describes a lot of, we're looking at a lot of specific problems with the question of water transfer. I'm assuming that question comes up because the water bond is looking at a peripheral canal, and we could get in a whole conversation about that and the prognosis there. But I'll just mention, I came out here, I'm from the Midwest. I came out here, I went to college at a school on the coast, and I read this book called Cadillac Desert. At that time, it was a drought time. At that time, I started to learn about the peripheral canal. I'm like, what is this? And I started to ask the kind of questions, which the kind of work that Andrea and Karen are doing really answer, like, why are we building these giant things that are just creating more problems rather than looking to nature, which solves a lot of these problems? And at the time I came out here, I was an undergraduate, and I was going to be a doctor, actually. And I read this book and I thought, oh my God, what are all these engineers doing? And I'm like, I got to become an engineer. And I became an environmental engineer, and I get to geek out on this kind of stuff. But I just want to say, we're at a really special point in time where we're continuing to solve a lot of problems with engineering. But we have the opportunity to really be solving those problems with natural infrastructure and with the kind of work that we have a legacy here in the Bay Area of doing. So I just want to say I appreciate that question, and I hope that we can go out and talk to our colleagues about the natural solutions.
With the effort to solve or address the water quality problems in the Bay. They've done a good job of pairing the two as co-equal goals of ecosystem and water supply. And I think that's, really points to what we've been talking about here today, is you can't, particularly in a place like the Delta and in a place that's so dependent on water because it's habitat, because there's levees protecting things, because it's agricultural land using the water, you can't pull at it and expect the thread to only unravel the part or work with one part of it. You really need to deal with the whole system. And so I think that is part of it. And so, for instance, in the case of the alternative conveyance facility, which they like to use for a while before they, there is a section of the Peripheral Canal actually got built back in the 70s, actually. They took a bunch of fill for high five, you can go see, but now it's going to be a tunnel. Anyway, long story. Coupled with that, there's talks of doing restoration of open space in the Delta that's around on the order of 65,000 acres. So quantities that would be certainly big drops in the bucket for the start of open space numbers that we've talked about today.
Thank you. A major question. What's happening on May 8th?
You're sweet. Somebody read the slide. And May 8th is the annual Open Space Conference. We do these conferences every year. We invite, everybody is welcome to come. Our website has more details. This year, our conference is actually focused on trying to listen to others, the 7 million people in the Bay Area, rather than just our community. So it'll be a place that's open and welcome, and I hope you can join us. It's held in the Presidio of San Francisco, and go to our website for more details.
Thank you. Wonderful to end on a celebration note.